It felt like the people who were the abolitionists that stood side by side with Harriet, that supported the underground.
Right.
I would say they were, for their time, the most radical. They launched attack after attack after attack on the institution of slavery. I associate it almost with the Bodhisattva archetypes.
Yeah. And the Bodhisattva trains in this attitude, this belief that everyone needs to be free. They're getting free as they're helping to get others free.
Welcome to the Spirit Underground podcast with Dharma teachers Spring Washam and Lama Owens. These conversations will include topics on Black liberation theology, healing with plant-based medicine, Indigenous wisdom, Buddhist-based meditation practices, and reconnecting to our ancestral knowledge. Together we will explore what freedom means individually, collectively, and spiritually. If you would like to support the Spirit Underground podcast, please visit the BeHereNowNetwork.com/donate. This is Spring Washam.
And this is Lama
Owens and Spring and the Spirit Underground.
Yes.
So this is a little awkward. It's our first ever episode.
And so I think, let's start with why we're doing it. Like, what is this show and why we're doing it? Why are we doing it?
Yeah, why are we doing it? Do you want to start?
Yeah. Well, you asked me to do it, and so...
I was clear about that. I couldn't do it without you.
So, I didn't have an idea about doing a show like this until you came to me and said, okay, I have this idea, we're going to do it, But beyond that, I just think that, this reality of the spirit underground is so important for us. I think we've been chosen, or we signed up somehow to do this work of really exposing people to this, this network, right? This network which mirrors and reflects the actual Underground Railroad in this, in this life, in reality, and how it reflects into the unseen world, into the spirit world, how the unseen world, the spirit world is still working, right? To get us free, right? In the same way many of us are still working within the material realm to get free. So I want us to talk about that and to explore that more in this podcast.
Absolutely. I think this is really what makes our show unique and our perspectives unique, is that we're going to be talking about these themes that maybe not everyone is thinking about or have even language to articulate.
Yeah.
I think this is what interested me, is that, with our backgrounds, which we can definitely talk a little bit about. Lama and I are both authors and Buddhist teachers, and also shamanic practitioners and public figures. And I think what's so interesting is that we're these public figures, but we also are very, what we would call ourselves, a spiritual abolitionist.
Right.
And that's a big theme of our show.
Yeah.
But you do want to say more about your background, Lama and your influences and a little bit more to share with folks.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the South, right, in North Georgia, which is historically Cherokee land. And, kind of growing up in a Southern Black community, church was very central, but even more particular, like the Black church, the experience of the Black church was something that was so deeply ingrained in me, right? And the Black church being this community where we remembered our history and remember that, we were still trying to get free, right? That we had been introduced into this, culture, this land as enslaved people, and we were still working to reclaim our humanity from, an anti-Black white supremacist system, which was constantly, you know, um, disrupting, the embodiment of our humanity or just our humanity in general, right? And so, like, I just kind of was raised in that, and on top of that, like, I loved, the literature, of Black liberation, kind of growing up. And my father was, a big part of that, as well as my mom. My mother is a minister, or as we say in the South, she's a preacher. you
You're
know,
a preacher's son.
I'm a preacher's son, and that was formative for me,
Mm.
to be the son or a child of a spiritual leader, of a clergy person, right? And so I was getting that religious, spiritual part of Black liberation from my mother, and then my father, who's this, like, an intellectual. I don't know if he would describe himself as intellectual, but he's a PhD, right? But even at a young age, like I remember at 12, I was reading W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery and the Souls of Black Folks, right? I was like 12 years old, and then after that, I was getting into Malcolm X, you know, um, and other, like, Black liberation thinkers and writers. And so I was just really at that age, and my early adolescence, really like thinking about this and asking myself, okay, how am I going to get involved in the work of Black liberation, right? And then it's the South, and too. There's something about the South that's just like rooted in me, and I think it's a lot to do with ancestry, you know. I again, as I was saying, I grew up on Cherokee land. I actually grew up very close. I didn't actually in the same city where Cherokee folks owned slaves during slavery,
Hmm.
right? And one of the sites, one of the last sites of Cherokee land that was ceded to the government, in the 1800s. So that was the city I grew up in, the town that I grew up in. So Indigenous history was very alive, and the pain and the trauma, of Indigenous history, which was culminated into the Trail of Tears, you know. So I grew up with that deep awareness that I was living on land, you know, that, the Cherokee folks were forced off of, and land that my ancestors worked as slaves, partially owned by Cherokee folks. So it was a very complicated history, right, growing up with. But that complexity is something that I've really embraced. I don't think anything is just black and white. I think there's a deep complexity and nuance to everything, including Black liberation work and including everything that we have access to get free.
Yeah, those are powerful influences. I mean, just being 9 years old and reading W.E.
Mhm.
Du Bois enough, and Malcolm
Mhm.
X as a couple years later, and then being in this place energetically where, this brutality happened. And, I think this suffering is what shapes us. You grew
Mhm.
up in Rome, Georgia. I grew up in
Yeah.
California
Mhm.
with this kind of hippie mother who was against Christianity and
Yeah.
was
Mhm.
and raised this kind of, we were vagabonds. I think
Right.
we moved around and caravanned around, and it was like I was influenced by that,
Yeah.
seeing the suffering, and also those early years of,
Mhm.
hearing about my father, who was African American and my mother's white,
Right.
and him um, being gone, and
Mhm.
being exposed to a lot of different spiritual ideas. And so I always think about myself as returning more over the last
Mhm.
few years to my Black
Mhm.
roots.
Right.
Like it was severed. I kind of
Right.
feel like it was severed. And now here we are,
Mhm.
after now we've gone on to practice Buddhism
Yeah.
and do all these other things, but there is a kind of returning happening, a deeper investigation about the Black church. There's a
Right.
powerful draw back to the South for a lot of
Right.
folks,
Oh, yeah.
back to the land.
Mhm.
Um, but our influences are always with us, right?
Yeah,
Here we are,
absolutely.
you know?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting too because, we're Black coming from slightly different experiences of Blackness, right?
Hmm.
Um, and then there's Buddhism, right? So we collided with Buddhism, which complicated things more.
Complicated our Blackness. Yeah, it's like, where does
Exactly.
this come in? This is from
Exactly.
Asia.
Yeah. I mean, I was like black, black. Like I'm, in the diaspora. I think Southern Black culture really dominates the African diaspora, right? To some resentment for folks living in different parts of the diaspora. But there's a way in which Blackness was defined and contextualized, where we were raised, with this idea that like this is Blackness. Like if you don't share these experiences, then we question, your
Hmm.
Blackness, right? And
Hmm.
then you go and convert to Buddhism, and then you get really suspect, where it's like, oh, wait, are you really Black? You know?
Exactly. So let's talk about this collision.
Yeah,
Yes, I definitely have many identity crises of
yeah.
sitting in these communities, meditating
Mhm.
and going, where am I? Where are my
Right,
people? Is this,
right.
you know, am I lost?
Yeah.
Knowing that the Dharma is so powerful, but also feeling a part of me is I lost something along the way
Mhm.
that you can't really name. And I think a lot of people are like that when they feel this connection to their history, their ancestors and their
Mhm.
land, but they're exploring outside of the church,
Right.
different philosophies, spirituality, different practices.
Mhm.
So let's talk about you had a collision course with Buddhism and I
Right.
did too, because there's something
Mhm.
there. And I
Mhm.
think part of our show, our podcast this time is to share what is valuable there.
Yeah.
What can we take and what can we adopt and what
Yeah.
can we integrate
Right.
here?
Right. Well, I do believe that part of Black liberation is actually having the agency to decide how we want to be free, right? I mean, I think that's an essential part of freedom itself is agency to choose, right? And for me, I know I got to kind of this wall in terms of liberation, right? I was really, really interested in social liberation, but I just didn't get how Christianity framed ultimate liberation. There was something that was too
Mm.
simple about dying and going to heaven. you know, like all I had to do was be a good person and go to heaven, and frankly, that wasn't interesting to me. It was just
Mm.
so simple. And I intuitively felt that the universe didn't do simple for some reason, you know? And so when I started coming into contact with Buddhism, which was actually through friends, right? Just developing relationships with people who were Buddhist, people my age, people who were radical and, involved in, activism and seeing how they embodied the practice. Like I just felt like they were doing something that was really complex and something that I felt really spoke more to how I felt about the ultimate experience, right? And I was excited by that, really, and I was excited about how Dharma talked about the mind, and the body and how it was so practical. I have
Mhm.
this term that I use, practical Dharma, right? That I'm writing about actually in my next book, where it was just like, oh, this is like a step methodical approach to not just social liberation, but into this mental, emotional liberation, which is where my battle front lines were. It was my mind that I was so lost in. I was lost in the depression and the despair and the hopelessness and the anger, and the trauma, right? And I was like, I need a medicine to to take me deep into this, right? And Dharma was that first medicine that took me there.
Absolutely. And I think that that's one of the beautiful things that we can share on this podcast are
Yeah.
the practices that were so helpful to us to
Hmm.
work with our minds. And I do think that's where, Christianity, the map isn't so clear.
Hmm.
It's like we can go to church on Sunday, but then on Monday, what happens when we're lost in despair
Yeah.
again? How
Yeah.
do we dig ourselves out of that? How does meditation and awareness and all these different methods to
Hmm.
help ourselves, where do they really fit? And
Yeah.
how do we do them without losing ourselves?
Yeah.
Our connections to who we are,
Right.
our where we were born, our
Hmm.
families, our church.
Hmm.
I think that that's a big piece as we move out, not to lose that thread as we
Right.
adopt different practices.
Right.
Because we're going to be sharing on this show a lot of practices.
Yeah.
Some people will love them and go, "This is great." Other
Right.
people might be scared of them and
Yeah.
go, "Wait, what
Yeah.
are they talking about? Magic
Hmm.
and plant medicine
Hmm.
and ceremonies
Hmm.
and spirits." Um, but
Yeah.
what we're talking about is sort of like an advanced practice of
Yeah.
liberation. We're talking
Well,
about using
mhm,
it all here.
exactly. But how do you work with the question of assimilation? Because I think that's something
Mm,
that's really big for a lot of people coming into these different traditions of practice. Like, how do we stay authentic, and really work with these practices in a way that is authentic?
mhm.
How have you done that?
Well, you know what I think it is like we're creating something new. We're
Yeah.
blending, the best of both worlds. We're
Right.
translating terminology. We are, so like for ourselves, if we do a ceremony where traditionally there's certain music,
Hmm.
we're singing gospel songs. So
Right.
there's this kind of adaptation happening, right? All the time where we're
Hmm.
making it relevant. We're
Hmm.
translating things into how we can understand them. And that seems very classic, like, the
Right.
84,000 Dharma doors. Like we're creating one
Mhm,
for ourselves and our
mhm,
communities.
mhm,
Um, so in a lot of ways, yeah, and this goes to the question of, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about around this question of adaptation is what is your definition
mhm,
of Black liberation theology?
mhm, mhm,
What would you say if somebody said, "Give me your
mhm,
understanding of how that fits right now in this time, Black
mhm.
liberation theology?"
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is how God has been implicit in the liberation of Black people, or our
Mm,
belief and faith in God and Christ have been a part of how we've understood freedom and experienced freedom, right? That's first and foremost. Um, and of course, Dr. James Cone, who we consider to be really one of, our elders in the study and thinking of Black liberation theology, who was a professor at Union Theological Seminary, who passed. He passed right before I got a chance to actually hear him
mm,
talk, but he wrote, several books, again, one of them being Black Liberation Theology, where he was really kind of touching into Black liberation movements, civil rights, Black power movement, and then beginning to think about liberation theology from the historical perspective of Black folks, particularly from the historical perspective of slavery and anti slavery abolition, and what Black liberation struggle actually means in terms of disrupting, more of a white supremacist treatment of Christianity, you know. But of course, liberation theology is rooted within the Exodus, so the freeing of the Jewish people, the children of Israel from the Egyptian empire, and into, through the Red Sea, parting the Red Sea, into the 40 years of wandering until they were able to settle into the promised land. You know, that is, like, for me, the strongest root of liberation theology. And then, of course, the ministry of Jesus, of Christ himself, as another foundation for liberation theology. But liberation theology in general, meaning that God is on the side of the most oppressed. Like, God is trying to get us free, and from a Black liberation perspective, we're saying that God is going to work things out for us. Right? In the same way he freed the children of Israel, right? God is going to send our Moses, you know, um, to free us, right? To take us through the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea, into our experience of liberation. And I think that's still something in process. Like, we've been freed from slavery, but we have to be freed from mental slavery,
Exactly. It's like we're let loose.
Right.
We're not free.
Right, right, like,
We're let
right,
loose. Yeah.
right, and this is why Buddhism excited me and continues to excite me, is that the ways in which it has helped me to experience more and more mental liberation and emotional liberation over, the 20 plus years I've been practicing, right? So it's
Absolutely.
complemented deeply my commitment to liberation theology, and specifically Black liberation theology. It's a compliment. Yeah, God is on the side of the oppressed, right? In the same way, and Dharma, particularly liberation Dharma or radical Dharma, as well, is that, yeah, like, ultimately we're already free.
We're
Like,
just remembering it.
we're just remembering, right? So we're gonna get there as long as we continue doing the work of remembering who we are.
And that's what I love about the simplicity of that. It's
Yeah.
like we're already awake, we're already there. We just forgot.
Yeah.
And this process of remembering, though, it's a long one. It seems like you gotta work on that. You gotta,
Mhm.
that we're so sleepy.
Yeah.
Right? We keep forgetting. Even
Mhm.
5 minutes after we hear some brilliant statement, we forgot it already. What did they say? What was
Exactly.
that again? And I
Exactly.
think one of the
Mhm.
things that came to me recently when I was sharing with you offline was that
Yeah.
I had a dinner party the other night at my house with some really beautiful
Mhm.
African American scholars, and we were talking about this forgetfulness and how trauma.
Right.
If you talk to people who have had traumatic childhoods, they don't remember them.
Yep.
Whole areas blacked out. And we were talking about that, in relationship to this new movie about the woman king.
Mhm.
And how there's a scene where she forgets. She intentionally wants
Right.
to forget the trauma, but then you forget your magic,
Yeah.
right? You can't just forget one thing. A blackout is a blackout. And so it feels like what I'm excited to be talking about on this show is this movement of remembering in
Mhm.
mass consciousness, like where our ancestors are helping us remember,
Mhm.
we're
Mhm.
helping each other remember. And as we work through this trauma,
Right.
it all becomes apparent. It's all there.
Mhm.
It's like these tangles in the mind obstructing the truth, which is so in relationship with the Buddhist philosophy, is that,
Right.
we're Buddhas, we forgot, and we're
Yeah.
in the process of revealing ourselves to ourselves.
Mhm.
But there's something exciting about this, feels like it's happening
Mhm.
in the Black community, rather it's on the films
Right.
depicting it.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on that? It just seems like we've got to remember our magic, and we've got to remember it
Yeah.
now. And I do believe Harriet Tubman is back to say, you have to remember this
Yeah.
now. I'm here to help you remember.
Mhm.
But yeah, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
mass remembering, waking up, something big feels like it's happening.
I think, yeah, definitely there's been a huge shift, and I think that huge shift has come from really the age that we've transitioned into. I think that like we're in this new age of, returning back to who we were. But to get back to who we were, we have to allow these systems that were created to distract us to kind of fall apart, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's painful. Absolutely, that's painful. And I think in the pain, there's a lot of folks waking up and saying, you know what, there's got to be a different choice here. There's got to be a different thing for me to do than just endure this pain. Like, how can I start dreaming into this new reality, this new world or culture or community that's actually based upon values of freedom and liberation and love and compassion instead of these values of commodification and restriction and contraction, and compartmentalism and power, you know. And I think we're beginning to see these kinds of awakening consciousness in art, right?
Mm-hmm.
The ways in which people are thinking differently and more critically, and then offering that work back to us to help to instigate our own awakening and dreaming, as well. And I think, the movement for Black lives is a part of that, absolutely, but I think it has to go further. You know, for me, what I am working towards and dreaming about is this kind of indigeneity, like a returning to a
Mm.
kind of indigenous embodiment, right? Where we're connected to the phenomenal world, that we're connected to the land and the unseen world. Like we're living in community with what I call this ecology, of all these beings and different sub communities, that we have this kind of deep sensitivity to how we fit in, right? And we're not trying to dominate, but we're trying to live with and ally with the phenomenal world, right? I think there's so much of the violence that has emerged for us over these many centuries of civilization is that like we have reverted to this practice of dominating the phenomenal world and dominating others, right? And I think that dominating comes from the ways in which we have been unwilling to take care of and tend to our own deep hurt, right? The ways in which we don't trust impermanence and change, and we choose to force things instead of allowing and being in allyship with and innovating and dancing with and being fluid with things as they're changing.
Absolutely. I really love that vision. And I think that is what we're doing. People are in the land and the earth is such a huge reminder of that letting go. It teaches us that. So this kind of return to this, like the tribe, right?
Yeah.
This tribal living, this way of living in exchange and generosity
Mhm.
and reciprocity,
Right.
right? We don't just take from Mother Earth.
Right.
We're in harmony. And this is a new paradigm for a lot of people.
Mhm.
It's rising. Because also with this liberation, this new version of this liberation theology comes to earth being like, hey, I'm involved in this liberation too.
Yeah.
There's nothing
Yes.
left out.
Yeah.
As we want to be liberated, the ocean wants to be liberated, the birds, the trees, the forest. And so there's something that really involves this wider lens,
Yeah.
right? That it's like our personal process and then the collective includes everything in our reality and all of the magic. And I think that this is where we want to share more on this with this podcast is this unseen world. Like we
Mhm.
are multidimensional
Mhm.
beings living in a vast universe. And we're more than just this human body
Yeah.
and this name and this identity and our
Yeah.
traumas and our
Yeah.
pain. It's so much bigger what's
Yeah.
going on here.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's important to understand identity within this context of liberation and freedom, that we're not who we have pretended to be, or we're not necessarily the roles that we've chosen for ourselves, or the roles that society has forced us into, that we're actually much more expansive than being queer or black, or, rich or poor, whatever, right? We're more than these identities. And we have to come into a place where we're like, yeah, and who am I beyond the rigidity of these identity locations?
Absolutely. And this is people very frightened, right?
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
holding on to identity, I think, is the one thing that limits us in our
Yeah.
liberation journey. If we hold
Yeah.
on too tight, we can't see the vastness of the stars. It's
Exactly.
almost like we're just looking just at the ground, It reminds me of our attention is just turned more inward. And so let's talk a little bit about these other terms. As you know, this is our first show,
Mhm.
and we're really defining and sharing and talking about these topics that we want to present. And one that comes up a lot is the spiritual abolitionism.
Yeah.
And,
Mhm.
I just wrote this book about Harriet Tubman,
Yeah.
and so much of it was about this movement in the
Mhm.
1830s, of this
Mhm.
scene of these young, fiery abolitionists,
Yeah.
and they were just going to burn down the house of slavery built,
Yeah.
they were like, that's it. And here we are talking about this years later, and we're sort of defining it in new ways all the time, the term. So what are your thoughts about this term, and how are we using it now? What does this mean to say I'm
Mhm.
a spiritual abolitionist?
Mhm. What did you discover from your work and research about this?
It felt like the people who were the abolitionists that stood side by side with
Mhm.
Harriet, that
Right.
supported the underground,
Right.
I would say they were for their time the most radical.
Yeah.
They were willing, what they had to face in order to do their work, helping others get free, was
Right.
serious.
Right.
They were willing to die for this. And so when I think about the abolitionists, they were willing to go to jail. Many lost everything, they lost their lives. And so for me, when I think of those early abolitionists, I think of just people who had this incredible courage,
Yeah.
right? And they stood firm. I mean, they launched attack after attack after
Right.
attack on the institution of slavery.
Right.
And you see remnants of that now,
Mhm.
and it's evolving,
Right.
right? And
Right.
some people use that term, but others are not at all familiar with that terminology, or it might
Mhm.
feel like a very old-fashioned word.
Right.
But I associate it almost with the bodhisattva archetypes.
Yeah.
I associate it with people who are willing to die for their cause,
Yeah.
and willing to risk their lives in order to help others.
Yeah. And the bodhisattva, is, the spiritual saint, is the saint in Buddhism, right?
Yes.
Who trains in this attitude, this belief that everyone needs to be free, you know, and they take that personally, like they're getting free, right, as they're helping to get others free, as well. And I think it's you're right. I think there's this kind of reemergence of the term abolitionist, and I think it's unfortunately being kind of diluted. I think
As
it's like
always.
it's always right. It's like, it's cool to be an abolitionist, but what we understand from anti-slavery abolition, which is where we're grounded in, you know, if you weren't willing to die, then you weren't an abolitionist, because everyone involved in abolition work, their lives were constantly in danger, and if people found out, even for those who were secretly working, like, even if they found out, there were such intense consequences, and, like, we have to return back to that energy. It's like either it's freedom or death, right? As
Right.
Harriet would say. It's like, I have a choice to two things. I'm going to get one of them, right, in this life,
Absolutely.
And how do we cultivate that intense intention, right, to understand that this is about getting free or death. Like, this isn't just about taking on another identity and saying, "Oh, this is cool. I'm an abolitionist," and then you don't do anything, right?
Mm.
Except wear the shirts and post on, social media, and say the right things. And this work is more than that, right? Like, this is a deep realization that there's a complexity here happening. There's a depth of delusion that we're trying to break through, and that we're tired. As Fannie Lou Hamer would say, you have to get sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? And we have to get to that point in order to start doing real liberation work, right? And for me, it's been this deep work of working through trauma. I knew that trauma was really keeping me from doing real work, in terms of, being an abolitionist, right? But
Mhm.
working through the trauma and saying, you know what, this is, there has to be something else than this, like, I need to be free, because I can't take this bondage anymore. And once you develop that attitude, that real authentic attitude, it's going to change you. It's going to change everything. It will change your relationships to people. I ended up in a 3-year retreat, right? Like, it has really shaped my whole life. Like, everything is about getting free, right? And from the outside, it may look really subtle, like, well, what's
Mhm.
Rod really doing? But like, internally, I'm really like working this out in a real
Mhm.
direct way. Like, I'm working out delusion, I'm working out love, I'm working out compassion. I'm getting clear, about things. I'm able to see things much more directly now. And I'm able to make choices that are much more aligned with liberation, not just for myself, but for the collective, right? Because abolition is about the collective, right? It begins with ourselves as individuals, because you know what? I can't get other people free until I understand freedom for myself. Of course, that's another issue, is that there are people working, as abolitionists, and they're actually not really that free. They're actually intentionally taking advantage of people, and I think we've seen that
Right.
really, really often, particularly in, the movement for Black Lives. You've seen a lot of activists come to a kind of like, um, I don't know, what do you call it? A kind of like notoriety, or fame, you
Mhm.
know? And then we say, okay, what are they really committed to? Because it just seems
Mhm.
like they're doing this to be known, not to really get people free, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said you've got to find this power in yourself to get free. Like, if we look at Harriet Tubman's life, she didn't just sit around and think about, wow, it'd be nice if someone came over here and helped me out. She was like, I'm willing to walk 100 miles, 120 miles. I'm willing to die
Right,
for this. I'm willing
right.
to go back. There was a, there's a kind of effort involved in freedom. And I think that's something we really, really need to emphasize here, as both of us have lived these spiritual lives. You've done 3-year retreats and have been trained as a
Mhm,
Lama. And I spent years doing retreats, all to work
mhm.
out these tangles.
Yep,
It's like, why do I'm let loose, but I'm still in jail? And that's a frustrating feeling. I'm let loose, but I'm
yeah,
still in jail.
mhm,
And these prisons in our minds that are the
mhm,
houses that trauma built, our ancestral traumas,
mhm,
what happened to our families. I think it's important that, one of the pieces that we're going to focus on is that you
mhm.
can get free from this. There's a
Exactly.
path, but you got to work. It's like
Yeah,
RuPaul, you better
that's
work,
right.
honey.
That's
You
right.
got to work for this,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
every day there has to be that. And no one can really save us but ourselves.
yeah.
We could get help, from the unseen world,
Mhm.
tremendous help.
Yeah.
But they're going to be inspired by our devotion to this
Yeah.
work first. Oh,
Yeah.
you're helping yourself. Great. Here, I'm going to blow this. I'm going to blow wind in your sails.
Yeah.
I'm going to help you.
Yeah.
I'm going to be with you. But there does have to be this kind of almost a ferocity with
Yeah.
it. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Oh,
To kind of
absolutely.
fight, like, I'm
You
going to
know?
wake up and I'm going to get these shackles off.
Yeah. It reminds me of what we used to say growing up is that if Jesus paid it all, then why am I still paying? you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
because what Jesus did was collective work. Like
Mm.
he was like, really like purifying this collective trauma,
Mm.
of that age through the way that he offered his body as an offering, a sacrifice. And of course, that's a very high level kind of practice to offer one's body in a way that you won't resent the offering, that you're offering your body, your life out of a deep embodiment of compassion. Like you
Oh
are
my gosh, we
grounded,
definitely have
rooted.
to have a show around that topic, like around what Jesus really, the collective
Yeah,
liberation and this
yeah,
offering, what you're saying. Yeah, as
yeah.
a pure radical purification.
Yeah,
Um,
and then Jesus was an example. I think part of what the crucifixion means in terms of liberation theology is that it was an example of what we may be called to do to get free, but it was also an example of how someone chose to do this collective labor of like really touching into this collective trauma and doing what they could to purify some of that through offering
right.
their body, right? But we have the rest of the work to do. And then you pointed it out really clearly is that, you know, we we have to do the work. Like Jesus or the Buddha or anyone, they just can't take on the work for us and do it for us and all of a sudden we're free. Right. I think that may be the most disappointing part of it, but for
It's
me,
sad. We hope that we
yeah,
hope for that. It's kind
yeah,
of like being saved. We hope, okay, now it's just a easy path now, right?
yeah.
And it's not.
Yeah, yeah. But I tell you, like, when I came into Dharma, the idea that I could do work to get free was also really intriguing and exciting because I didn't have to, like, give away my agency to another being, a god, and hope that they
Mhm.
would get me free. Like, I was being given the practices and told, like, "If you do this, you will get free," and that's been absolutely the case because, I have come a very long way from where I started, right? As we used to sing in church, right? I've come a very long way. I'm not where I used to be, and I thank God that I'm not where I used to be, and I'm not where I used to be because of this profound practice of liberation, right? The social liberation work, which I trained in for the first part of my life, right? That was the foundation. And then when I came into Dharma gave me the mental, emotional, practices, for the liberation of the mind. And bringing both of those together has created this profound experience where I'm able to be in the world and able to be in the depth of this period of apocalypse and still be okay, you know?
Yes.
Like, I'm okay.
Yes.
And I know people listening to this saying, well, it sounds like you should be more than okay, but you don't really know how much I've had to do to be okay.
And what it takes.
Yeah, I
Exactly.
celebrate being
Exactly.
okay. My God, like, this is like
Mm.
the most, like, this is, I never thought I would be okay, right? You
Well, you're
know?
not the only one who thinks like that.
Yeah,
Most people wake up every day and think, am I going to be okay?
yeah,
That's a thought many people have every day. Am I going to make it through this day? Am I going
yeah,
to be okay? How am
yeah.
I? And what do I do?
And even if I have doubts about making it through the day, I'm still okay because like I'm more than this body. And
Right.
that's part of why I'm okay because I realize that I'm more than this form that I'm relating to. I'm actually much more expansive and fluid, than this. And that helps me to really be in the world and say, whatever happens, happens. Whatever comes, comes.
Yeah, you do have a lot of equanimity. Knowing you, yeah, you're just like this redwood tree rooted, and this is
Yeah,
kind of unmovable with
yeah,
whatever seems to arise.
yeah, yeah.
I appreciate that about your spirit.
Well, thank you. Appreciate
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I love these conversations so
Yes.
much. And these are the conversations, it's our first show,
Yeah.
Rod,
Yeah.
and we have so much that we want to share on each episode about getting into the real practices, getting into the theology, the mindset,
Mhm.
and how to help people um, do this work of liberation for people who are like, okay, give me a map, give me the how to's. We want to be offering these practices that have helped
Right.
us.
Right.
And also, one of the things that we'll be talking that makes, I think, our show particularly unique, being that we have all these intersections, is the world of plant medicine,
Right.
which, I've been a part of going down to the jungle since
Mhm.
2007.
Right.
And Rod and I became really close on one
Mhm.
of my 14-day retreats in Peru.
Mhm.
And we started working with plant medicine to accelerate our healing process. Like
Right.
these huge tangles of trauma,
Yeah.
we have to move now.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
needed.
Yeah.
And what could take years to unravel can be done in a safe.
Right.
I'm not going to say easy, Rod. I'm going to say
No.
quick, but not easy.
Exactly.
That
Yeah.
there's a difference here, everybody. Some people think plant medicine, oh, give me the easy pill. Well, there's two paths. One could take a long time around the mountain, but you're going at a certain pace. And one you have to
Mhm.
scale straight up and use all your strength.
Yeah.
It's a shortcut, but not an easy cut,
Yeah.
So just to know that.
Yeah.
Um, but this is also one of the topics that we want to bring in
Mhm.
is the whole world of plant medicine into this liberation conversation.
Mhm.
How do we even adopt this as we're doing our spiritual abolitionism and we're using plant based medicine to wake up, to get free,
Mhm.
to be strong, to walk with our head held high,
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
open our hearts, and to live and be okay?
Yeah. Yeah. And to live, you know, I think about the song of Happy Day,
Mm,
which is one of my favorite songs, as you know,
yeah.
to live rejoicing, and for me,
Joyfully.
joyfully, like, and for me, rejoicing and being joyful is really just rooted in gratitude. Like, how can I live gratefully?
Mm.
Like,
Yes.
that's my goal. Like, that's what I am working to deepen every day, is to live gratefully, and in that gratefulness to experience joy, to experience this kind of deep connection to the world. Like, I want to live in a world where, like, I just have this incredible agency and potential, right? And no matter what
Yes.
happens at this point in my practice in life, no matter what happens, like tomorrow we may be living in a totalitarian regime, or we may already be living in
Yeah,
one.
some form.
Like I may wake up in the morning with all of my rights taken away,
Mm,
which is more and more a reality these days. Like, regardless of what happens, I have at this point everything I need to get free. I've been given everything now. And that's what I rejoice in. Like, over the past 20 years of practice, I have accumulated everything that I need to continue. Like, I don't have to go to any more teachings. I don't have to like read any more books, because I'm like situated within my experience, right? I know how to rest in my mind, and I want
Mm,
all of us to get to that place, right? And I think, there are so many modalities, including plant medicine, ayahuasca, right, that can take us there,
mhm.
like, really quickly, if we're willing to go there. If we're willing to hold the speed of it, and to hold the weight. Like, this is a weightedness here, right? And
Yes.
there's a courage. Like, you have to have the courage, not just to do plant medicine, but you have to have the courage to step onto a path and onto a spiritual path like Dharma, right? In Buddhism. Like, you have to have the courage because it's going to take you there, but it'll take you there if you're ready to go there and if you want to go there. Like, freedom has to be consensual. Like, I have to consent to getting free. I just can't go around saying, oh, I'm going to get free, but I have to mean it. When we start meaning freedom, it means that we're going to have to go through the trauma, right? And we have to move through this. And it feels like sometimes that you're just being ripped apart.
Well,
But
you
it's the
are
ego. We are.
energetically,
You're
right?
right.
Everything we've believed is
Yeah.
upside down,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
there is a fear that people have of losing it, but
Mhm.
it isn't really anything worth hanging on to.
Yeah.
It's some version of ourselves,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah.
And how
I
do we
mean,
do
mhm.
that?
Yeah.
Walk this path. How
Yeah.
do we influence and encourage and offer what has worked for us?
Yeah.
You're right, Rod. We have everything in our toolkits.
Yeah.
Hallelujah.
Yeah.
I feel like really I'm giving everything. You're
Yeah.
right. Books,
Yeah.
practices, medicines,
Yeah.
teachers, at this stage, everybody, and a lot of other people are given everything they need to, right?
Right.
So at this point, it's a choice.
Yeah.
We have everything we need. And for anyone listening, remember that to
Yeah.
get free. And we just have to be willing to utilize all of the gifts that we're given.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that, what practice turns into is like a snowball effect. Like, you just build up this momentum and you can't help
Mm.
but, get free. In writing my book, I'm talking a lot about freedom, abolitionist, spiritual abolition and so forth, but what we need to get free. And once we start really engaging in these tools like compassion and love and joy, it becomes irresistible. Like, you get to a point where like freedom is just irresistible. You can't fight it anymore. It's we become charmed, like a snake, how a snake is charmed. We become charmed by liberation and we want to get there, you
And we
know.
crave it. We don't
Yeah,
want, and we know when it's fake. Yeah, we
yeah,
know when it's not
you know,
exactly. We know the
just
kind of the realness of it,
yeah,
or we can taste it.
yeah. Just like we used to sing growing up in church, woke up with my mind and stayed on freedom, and
Mm.
stayed on Jesus and everything. Like, you want to get to a place where you're just like, your mind is just directed into liberation, you know?
Yes. And I think of when I think about that, I think of Dr. King and the
Yeah.
civil rights movement. I mean,
Mhm.
they woke up with their mind on freedom
Mhm.
every day
Right,
until it
right,
changed. There
right.
was a non-compromising movement there.
Yeah,
There was a one way. We are moving toward this,
yeah,
and that's Harriet too.
yeah, yeah. And
And
yeah,
there's something powerful in igniting that and
yeah,
knowing that our ancestors are saying, hey, this is possible. Set your
yeah,
mind to
yeah,
this. Now it feels mental, right?
yeah,
It's the battle of consciousness
yeah.
now.
And these great leaders, Dr. King and Malcolm X and Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass. I mean, I can go on and on. Audre Lorde, I think, and so forth. Bell Hooks, you know,
Yes.
like, I just
Yes.
think that these folks loved Black people, and I
Hmm.
don't think it feels like a lot of our leaders in the Black community. I don't know if I want to say a lot, but I feel like not all of our great change
Hmm.
leaders in the Black community love Black people.
Oh, I think that's so profound what you're
Yeah.
saying because, as my book is coming out in January, The Spirit of Harriet Tubman, Awakening from the Underground, which Lama wrote a beautiful foreword to. one of the things that she wanted, and the book is channeled for the listeners, you have to get a copy for yourself to understand the story. One of the biggest things over and over that she wanted me to highlight was how much she loved everyone.
Yeah.
And how much her spirit, even though she looked ferocious all the time, she looked
Right.
like, woo, panther,
Yeah.
ready to,
Mhm.
bite. That was a wrathful form, but her heart was just this overwhelming love
Mhm.
for the people. And I think, yes, and you felt that from Dr. King too, that he
Mhm.
loved these, when he was in Birmingham and he loved the people of Birmingham. Like, we
Yeah.
are going to get there. I'm
Yeah.
going to have to carry you on my back. We're
Right.
getting there
Right.
because I love you. And I guess, that's a beautiful place to maybe start to close out our first
Mhm.
episode, and how we can
Yeah.
transition into the next one is like about this love. Like,
Yeah.
yes, this has to be rooted in loving
Yeah.
ourselves and our people and loving freedom itself,
Mhm.
and authentically.
Right.
Authentically. And how just I want to make a point because I, have rediscovered Martin Luther King, and maybe we can spend a
Mhm.
whole episode on his birthday coming up in
Mhm.
January, something like having our own conversation about it. But when he won the Nobel Peace Prize and he won all this money, he immediately gave it to the Christian Leadership Conference.
Right.
He never kept any of it. They stayed exactly where they were. It wasn't even a thought.
Mhm.
It was like, oh, the movement needs this. So this money isn't even for me, it's for them anyway.
Mhm.
So there is something about that purity, and we're all learning too. So I'm not judging people for
Right.
where they are and what they're trying to do. Neither one of us are.
Right.
But
Exactly.
this higher love, Rod, has to
Mhm.
be at the heart has to be really activated here, and
Mhm.
and leading the way with this, right? That's the
Mhm.
spiritual abolitionist part, right?
Mhm.
Or that's
Exactly.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, the love itself, like that. Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Like we have to lead with the love, and to love Black people doesn't mean you hate white people. You know,
Exactly.
and that I know,
Exactly.
and this is how Black love gets manipulated and flipped
Mm.
around to say that like to be pro Black is to be anti white. Just no, to be to to love Black folks is to remember that like I don't know that we're part of something that has been degraded for centuries,
Mm.
right? So our
Mm.
love of Black people is a restoration, right? Which isn't pushing anyone away. It's just an acknowledgement that there are ways in which white supremacy has diminished our lives and our understanding of who we are. And we're trying to restore that, right? But in the
Mm.
restoration of love for ourselves and community, it means that like that restoration actually becomes a mirror for white folks reflecting back the ways in which they're expressing anti-blackness, and how anti-blackness is a critical part of maintaining whiteness and white supremacy. White supremacy, right, as a structure of power and dominance, but white supremacy also as an identity location, or whiteness as an identity
Mm.
location. And that's painful. So when you hear us talking about Black love, if you're white identified, you will feel that discomfort. You may feel that discomfort, right? I'm not going to make that assumption for everyone. You will, but you may feel a discomfort that's actually the ways in which, your dependency on anti-Blackness is actually being challenged, right? Unconsciously, maybe, right? And so you have to
Yes.
interrogate that. As we used to say, we used to say growing up in my activist community, we have to interrogate all of this.
Interrogate these. And we do it right now. We need to interrogate all lies that we have
Yeah.
been programmed to
Mhm.
believe are truth. And that is
Right.
something, interrogating ourselves and where our discomfort is.
Yeah.
Yeah, Black Lives Matter does
Yeah.
not mean white lives don't matter.
Right.
Nobody said that.
Mhm.
And so,
Mhm.
it's just saying, it's just something different. And I love that. And and I think that we can teach this higher evolution of this, because I do believe that if we follow in the footsteps of some of the most
Mhm.
powerful movement leaders
Right.
they were rooted in this. They weren't confused about this piece, this love piece. They had that clarity. And I think that's where we can restore our power, and we can create a bigger movement, and move this liberation, this path, open the gates, move it forward, clear the road, as we're doing this work of clearing. I feel like you and I sometimes, when we're in our shamanic selves, we're opening gates and moving obstacles and aligning things. So I'm so happy about our first podcast. Hope it's juicy. These are conversations on liberation. I love it.
A real conversation.
And we will be getting into so much more. This is our first in our series here, first kickoff podcast, which really is just framing all of the conversations that we like to have. We also will be having many one-on-one conversations, but and sometime we hope to invite really beautiful guests to join us in these conversations to share more about the theology, the practices, the medicine, and the ways to rise up. Freedom.
Yes.
So juicy. I love it. Okay, everybody. And that'll be us and Spirit Underground signing off for the moment.
Be
Thank
well.
you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much, Rod.
Thank you, Spring.
Years and years under the master's will. Years and years of hurting each other. We gotta turn it all around. Turn it all around. No way, no way, no way. No way. 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 No